Imagine your home becoming a target, not by strangers in the night, but by the very people claiming to keep the neighborhood safe. Imagine waking up morning after morning to destruction, your peace shattered, and knowing deep down it wasn't an accident. What would you do when the ones meant to protect you are the ones hunting you? This story will show you exactly how far one man was pushed, and how he fought back in a way they never saw coming. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories of ordinary people standing tall against powerful HOAs, overreaching neighbors, and unfair harassment, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us share more stories like this one, and you won't want to miss what happens in this fight. The night air was still on the ranch, a deep quiet broken only by the hum of crickets in the distance. A gravel driveway wound through tall grass, leading to a single wooden mailbox standing by the edge of the road. To most, a mailbox was nothing more than a place for letters and bills. To David Carter, it was more than that. It was a symbol, a mark of ownership, a statement that this patch of earth belonged to him. After years of city life, after decades of quiet discrimination and constant noise, this was his sanctuary. Or so he thought. The first strike came quietly. Tires screeched in the distance, headlights swept across the ranch road, and by morning, his mailbox lay in splintered pieces. At first, David tried to explain it away. Would rots, accidents happen, maybe someone misjudged the turn. But then came the second time, and the third. And with each crash, the evidence became undeniable. Tire marks cut deep into the soil, always leading from the same path. The SUVs weren't random passers-by. They belonged to the neighborhood patrol, the so-called HOA cops. They weren't real officers, just hired enforcers given a sense of power by a homeowners association that prided itself on control. Their SUVs crawled through the nearby subdivision with flashing lights and self-importance, intimidating anyone who didn't fit their picture of belonging. And David, with his sprawling ranch just beyond their beige fences, was a reminder of everything they couldn't control. The harassment escalated with a chilling precision. Each week, the mailbox was flattened. Packages vanished from his porch. Trash cans were mysteriously overturned at night. Garbage littered the driveway. Even when he worked outside, cars slowed to watch him, their drivers' eyes lingering with silent questions. Why are you here? For David, the mailbox was no longer just wood and nails. It was a battleground. Every time he rebuilt it, stronger and sturdier, they came back to destroy it again. 6 times. 7 times. 8 times. Each hammer strike as he rebuilt was an act of defiance, but each late-night crash was a reminder that his peace was fragile, vulnerable. The breaking point came one brittle autumn evening. The sky was painted in fading red as he worked on his fence. Then, the familiar sound, the growl of an engine, the rush of tires tearing through gravel, and the violent crack of wood shattering. He dropped everything and sprinted toward the road, but by the time he arrived, the SUV's taillights had already disappeared into the HOA-controlled street. What remained was yet another mailbox, crushed and mocking, lying broken in the ditch. David's fists clenched, his jaw tightened. He wasn't just angry. He was done. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't kids fooling around. This was targeted harassment, and it was meant to send him a message. You don't belong here. But David had his own message to send. That night, under a pale moon, he made a decision. If they wanted to keep running over his mailbox, then he would build one they couldn't destroy. He wouldn't break the law. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, he would turn their own aggression against them. He studied regulations. He pored over county codes. He measured distances and double-checked designs. On the outside, his new mailbox would look ordinary, painted white, charming, a farmhouse classic. But inside, it would be something else entirely. Reinforced with steel. Anchored in concrete. A fortress hidden in plain sight. And deep down, David knew, they wouldn't be able to resist. The decision had been made, and once it settled into David's bones, there was no turning back. That night he sat at his kitchen table with a single lamp glowing, papers scattered across the surface. County regulations lay open beside him, lines highlighted, notes scribbled in the margins. If the HOA cops wanted to play their games in the shadows, he would answer them in the light of the law. Every detail of his plan had to be airtight. Every bolt, every measurement, every anchor sunk into the ground would have to withstand not just their SUVs but also the scrutiny of inspectors if it ever came to that. To the untrained eye, the sketches looked like ordinary mailbox designs. To David, they were blueprints of resistance. He carefully balanced two worlds: compliance on the surface, defiance underneath. On the outside, he envisioned a simple farmhouse-style box. White paint, a red flag, the kind you'd see on postcards. But inside, he would bury the heart of his creation in reinforced steel and stone, rooted deep into the earth with concrete so thick that no set of tires could hope to dislodge it. The next morning, he began collecting supplies. At the hardware store, he loaded his truck with bags of quick-dry cement, lengths of rebar, steel plates, and a perfectly legal mailbox kit. To anyone watching, he looked like a man fixing up his ranch. But beneath the surface, every purchase was a brick in the wall of his quiet rebellion. Back on the ranch, he began the work in silence. First came the hole, deep, precise, carved into the stubborn earth until his shovel clanged against stone. Sweat soaked his shirt, dirt caked his hands, but each scoop felt purposeful. Next, he mixed the cement, pouring it until the ground swallowed it whole, encasing the rebar like bones in concrete. The steel post slid in afterward, perfectly straight, its base invisible beneath the surface but anchored as if it were part of the earth itself. Then came the armor. He welded steel plates together, sliding them into the hollow post and encasing the structure like a shield. By the time he bolted the outer shell together, the thing resembled an ordinary rural mailbox. White paint fresh and clean, flag polished red. But beneath that charm was a fortress disguised as simplicity. It took him days to finish, and each night as he worked under the dim glow of a floodlight, he felt the eyes of the HOA patrol watching from a distance. Their SUVs slowed as they passed, headlights sweeping over him like searchlights. He could almost hear their unspoken questions. What's he building now? They didn't know, and that ignorance was his advantage. When the last coat of paint dried, David stepped back and admired the work. It looked almost delicate, standing there at the edge of the road. Neighbors driving by would see nothing unusual, nothing threatening. But David knew what lived beneath the surface: steel bones, concrete roots, and a post that wasn't just planted in the soil but fused with it. He called it his sentinel. But building the mailbox was only half the battle. The other half was waiting. Waiting for the moment he knew would come, the night when headlights would appear again, when the roar of an engine would rise in the darkness, and when someone drunk with power would slam into what they thought was just another fragile post. The waiting gnawed at him. For the first few nights, sleep eluded him. He sat by his front window, lights dimmed, the silhouette of the new mailbox visible in the glow of the moon. Every time a car passed on the distant road, his heart thudded faster. Would this be it? Would tonight be the night? But the patrol cars stayed their distance, at least at first. It was as if they sensed something had changed. Instead of roaring down the ranch road recklessly, they lingered further away, circling but not striking. It made the anticipation stretch, wound tight like a spring ready to snap. David filled the time with quiet preparation. He installed cameras on the property, discreet but effective, lenses hidden in trees and fence posts. This time, if something happened, there would be no denials, no blaming kids, no shrugging off responsibility. This time, the evidence would speak. Days turned to weeks, and the tension in the air only thickened. Neighbors noticed the patrol's unease. Some whispered, wondering why the HOA seemed so obsessed with one ranch owner. Others stayed silent, unwilling to get caught in the crossfire. David kept to himself, tending his land, fixing fences, feeding his animals. Outwardly, life seemed normal again. Inwardly, he was a coiled spring, waiting. Then came the night when the silence broke. It was late, close to midnight. The air was cold, the kind of chill that seeps into the bones. David sat near the window again, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the mailbox stood quietly, almost innocent-looking against the frost. Then, in the distance, the sound began. Low at first, like a growl carried on the wind. Headlights crested the hill, twin beams slicing through the dark. The SUV slowed as it neared his driveway, prowling like a predator testing its prey. For a heartbeat, David thought maybe they would pass, maybe they would circle away. But then the engine roared. Tires spun against gravel, headlights locked on their target, and the SUV barreled forward. David didn't flinch. He watched as the scene unfolded, the rush of metal, the spray of gravel, and then the inevitable collision. The roar of the SUV was deafening as it surged forward, headlights blazing like twin predators' eyes. The engine strained, wheels bit deep into the gravel, and the smell of burning rubber filled the cold night air. In that instant, all of the months of harassment, all of the broken wood, all of the quiet nights shattered by violence, funneled into a single moment of impact. The crash landed like thunder. Metal met steel, and the result was catastrophic. The SUV's hood folded in on itself like crumpled paper, the front axle snapping with a sickening crack. Airbags exploded in white bursts, glass shattered outward, and the roar of the engine cut instantly to silence, replaced by the groan of twisted metal and the hiss of steam pouring from the ruined engine block. The mailbox did not move. It stood tall and unbroken, its white paint gleaming faintly in the moonlight. To any passerby, it looked ordinary, untouched. But the SUV that had underestimated it lay crippled at its base, crushed against the immovable wall of concrete and steel that lay hidden beneath the earth. Inside the cab, chaos reigned. The driver, one of the HOA's self-proclaimed enforcers, stumbled out, clutching his forehead where blood streamed down from a cut opened by the crash. His arm hung awkwardly, pain etched across his face. For the first time since the campaign of harassment had begun, he looked powerless, exposed. From the porch of his house, David watched it all unfold. His boots crunched against frosted grass as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold. He didn't need to say a word. The sight spoke for itself. The hunter had become the hunted. And then, one by one, the neighborhood stirred. Porch lights flicked on, curtains shifted, and doors creaked open. Shadows moved in the windows as neighbors peered out, whispering to one another. The sound of the crash had ripped through the silence of the night, dragging into the open what had long been hidden. For months, rumors had circulated about David's troubles, about the strange obsession the HOA had with his mailbox, about the patrol cars that slowed and lingered near his land. Now, the truth was on full display. The HOA's campaign of intimidation could no longer hide in the shadows. The sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes, red and blue lights painting the frost-covered road. They assessed the scene, their eyes moving from the mangled SUV to the perfectly intact mailbox standing tall beside it. Cameras clicked as photographs were taken, measurements marked. David stood quietly to the side, calm but resolute. He had anticipated this moment, and he knew the law was on his side. The mailbox, though fortified, was fully within county code. It was legal. It was permitted. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. But the HOA enforcer had no such defense. His vehicle, destroyed beyond repair, was evidence enough. No excuses could cover the truth. No vague accusations about reckless kids. No quiet denials whispered at HOA meetings. The SUV had struck something immovable, and the man behind the wheel had been caught in the act. Whispers spread quickly among the neighbors who gathered at the edge of the road. Some stared with shock, others with barely concealed satisfaction. For them, the spectacle was more than just a crash. It was proof. The HOA, with all its arrogance and control, had finally overplayed its hand. The sheriff's deputies questioned David briefly, but his answers were simple, factual, calm. He had done nothing but rebuild a mailbox, something destroyed repeatedly without consequence. He had complied with every regulation, followed every rule, and now stood before them as a man who had done nothing wrong. The patrolman, on the other hand, had no answers that mattered. As the tow truck hauled the broken SUV away, steam still hissing from its twisted frame, a silence settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't the silence of intimidation anymore. It was the silence of reckoning. The unspoken power the HOA cops had wielded for so long had been shattered in the crash, and now everyone could see it. For David, the moment was more than just vindication. It was the first breath of peace he had felt in months. Standing by the unbroken mailbox, he felt control return, not in violence, not in retaliation, but in resilience. He hadn't struck back with fists or rage. He had stood his ground legally, patiently, and with unshakable resolve. And in the end, their aggression had destroyed itself. But he knew this was not the end of the story. The HOA would not vanish quietly. Their pride had been wounded, their image tarnished. What they had once ruled through fear had now been exposed as weakness. And in communities ruled by control, weakness does not go unanswered. David braced himself. The crash was only the beginning of a larger battle. In the days that followed the crash, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. Whispers drifted through streets lined with manicured lawns and beige fences. The patrol SUV had been hauled away in plain sight, its twisted frame impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had long suspected something was wrong now had confirmation. But instead of facing accountability, the HOA launched into damage control. The first move was silence. No official notice, no admission, just a void filled with carefully worded half-truths. At the next HOA meeting, residents were told that the patrol officer had been involved in a routine accident while performing his duties. The details were vague, deliberately so. The mailbox wasn't mentioned, nor was David's name. They tried to erase the reality that dozens of people had already seen with their own eyes. Behind closed doors, however, the story was different. The HOA board scrambled to contain the fallout. Their patrol, the very symbol of their authority, was suddenly tainted. What had once been their tool of intimidation now hung like a millstone around their necks. They suspended the driver, not out of justice, but out of necessity. He had become a liability, and liabilities threatened the image they worked so hard to project. For David, the silence from the board was telling. No one knocked on his door. No one offered apologies. Instead, he noticed the shift in how people looked at him. Some neighbors nodded in quiet solidarity, finally emboldened by proof of the harassment. Others avoided his gaze, wary of being caught on the wrong side of the HOA's wrath. The community was dividing, cracks spreading through the carefully polished facade of unity. The patrol cars, once a constant presence near his ranch, grew scarce. For weeks, the road was quiet at night, free of headlights sweeping over his barn or tires grinding into gravel outside his driveway. It was almost peaceful, but David knew better than to mistake retreat for surrender. The HOA had been embarrassed, yes, but humiliation breeds anger, and anger often finds new outlet. In their offices, board members debated strategy. They couldn't directly retaliate without risking exposure, so they turned to subtler weapons: paperwork, fines, and endless bureaucracy. A letter arrived in David's mailbox, crisp and official, though he wasn't even part of their association. It claimed that his fence line encroached onto community-managed land. Another alleged that his barn's exterior paint didn't meet aesthetic standards for the neighborhood. Each accusation was hollow, each demand unenforceable, but the intent was clear. If they couldn't break him with intimidation, they would try to bury him in paperwork and false claims. David recognized the tactic for what it was: harassment dressed as administration. He filed responses meticulously, each backed with county records, survey maps, and legal citations. He copied the sheriff's office on every reply. If the HOA wanted to wage war with paper, then he would match them document for document. Meanwhile, neighbors continued to whisper. Some began to share their own stories. Packages lost, driveways blocked, threats whispered when fees were paid late. The crash had given them courage to speak, and slowly, a picture emerged of an HOA that had long abused its authority. David had simply been their boldest target. The tension reached a boiling point when local news caught wind of the story. It started as a rumor, a few lines buried in a community blog about an unusual crash involving a patrol vehicle. But soon, the story spread. Pictures of the mangled SUV began circulating online, paired with accounts from neighbors who had seen the crash with their own eyes. The narrative the HOA had tried so carefully to control was slipping away. Reporters came knocking, their questions sharp. What was the patrol doing on a private ranch road? Why had a mailbox been hit repeatedly? Why was a homeowners association employing patrol cars that acted like police? The HOA responded with the same strategy they always used: denial. They claimed ignorance, painted the patrol as a volunteer service, and insisted that no harassment had ever taken place. But the more they spoke, the more their words rang hollow. The image of the shattered SUV spoke louder than any excuse. For David, watching the story spread brought a strange mix of relief and caution. On one hand, the truth was finally being seen. On the other, he knew that cornered power does not fade quietly. The HOA had lost control of the narrative, but they still had resources, influence, and a reputation they would fight to protect. And so, the quiet nights returned to his ranch, but they were filled with an uneasy anticipation. He knew the board was plotting its next move. He knew his victory, though satisfying, had painted a target on his back. The crash had dragged their feud into the light, but battles fought in the open are rarely the last. What he didn't yet know was that the HOA's desperation would soon turn their own community against them, and that mailbox, standing unbroken at the edge of the road, would become more than a symbol of defiance. It would become a monument of truth. The crash had left a scar deeper than twisted steel and shattered glass. It had torn open the illusion of control the HOA had maintained for years. For the first time, neighbors began to question not just what had happened to David, but what had been happening to all of them. At first, the conversations were whispered. A woman walking her dog stopped to chat with another on the corner, lowering her voice as she mentioned late-night patrols slowing in front of her home. A father confided that his teenage son had been pulled over by an HOA cop for riding his bike too fast in the subdivision. A retired couple quietly admitted that they'd been fined for leaving their trash cans out for one extra day, while other board members seemed exempt from the same rules. The crash, witnessed by so many, had given residents the courage to connect their own private experiences to a larger truth. The HOA wasn't protecting them. It was controlling them. Meanwhile, David went about his days quietly, tending to his ranch as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Neighbors he had once only nodded to from a distance now slowed their cars to wave. Some even stopped to talk, cautiously at first, as if afraid of being seen, then more openly as solidarity grew. They asked about his mailbox, about the harassment, about the patrol cars that had become less visible since the crash. David answered plainly, never dramatizing, never exaggerating. He didn't need to. The evidence stood at the edge of his driveway, a mailbox still perfectly intact, and a story everyone already knew. The HOA board, however, sensed their grip slipping. Their carefully cultivated authority was beginning to fracture. At the next community meeting, what was once a controlled room of polite nods and compliance turned into something they hadn't experienced before: resistance. Questions were raised loudly, pointedly. Why were thousands of dollars being spent on patrol SUVs that acted outside the law? Why was one family fined relentlessly while board members seemed immune? Why had the HOA denied the crash when so many had seen it? The board members shifted uncomfortably, their responses fumbling, their authority cracking under the weight of scrutiny. For years they had relied on intimidation and silence to maintain control. Now, silence was no longer working. the divide grew sharper. On one side stood those who had benefited from the HOA's reign, board members, their allies, and residents who valued rigid order over fairness. On the other stood those who had been quietly suffering, their grievances now given legitimacy by the spectacle of the crash. David found himself in an unexpected position. He had never asked to lead, never sought attention, yet his quiet resilience had made him a symbol. He was the neighbor who hadn't folded under pressure, who had rebuilt again and again until he finally turned their own aggression back on them. People began to see in his story the courage to confront their own. The HOA responded in the only way they knew how, by doubling down. New letters arrived, this time addressed not only to David but to others who had begun voicing dissent. Citations for lawn heights, threats of fines for unapproved exterior decorations, demands for compliance with obscure rules buried deep in the bylaws. The message was clear: if you side against us, you will pay. But instead of creating fear, the heavy-handed tactics fueled anger. Neighbors began organizing their own meetings outside of HOA control. Small gatherings in living rooms and backyards turned into discussions about bylaws, about board elections, about transparency. The seeds of rebellion were being planted, and for the first time, the HOA board faced not isolated complaints, but a community beginning to unite. For David, the change was visible. Where once patrol cars had prowled near his driveway, now they stayed far away. Where once neighbors avoided his gaze, now they greeted him openly. His mailbox, once a target of destruction, now stood as a rallying point. People driving by slowed not to glare, but to admire, the little white box that had stood against the weight of harassment. But beneath the growing solidarity, tension simmered. The board was angry, cornered, and dangerous in its desperation. What happens when power begins to slip? It doesn't surrender quietly. It lashes out. David knew the battle was far from over. The crash had started a chain reaction, one that was spreading faster than the board could contain. The community was dividing, and the HOA was losing its grip. But in a war between control and truth, the next moves would determine everything. The question was no longer whether David could stand alone. It was whether the entire neighborhood would stand with him, or whether the HOA would find new ways to strike back. The HOA board had built its reputation on control, on keeping residents in line through intimidation and an endless stream of rules. For years it had worked. But after the crash, after the whispers and the questions, they felt their grip slipping. And when people who thrive on power feel it start to crumble, they don't surrender. They strike back harder. The retaliation came quietly at first, disguised as routine enforcement. Letters began appearing in mailboxes across the subdivision, each one sharp and accusatory. Lawns deemed too long were fined. Garden sheds were flagged as non-compliant. Decorative wreaths were suddenly labeled unapproved seasonal displays. The rules hadn't changed, but the enforcement had. Where once the board had looked the other way, now they scrutinized every detail, punishing anyone who dared to show the slightest sign of sympathy for David. For David himself, the letters came with relentless precision. One accused him of allowing livestock odors to drift across the property line. Another insisted that his driveway gravel wasn't the correct size and shade. Yet David wasn't even a dues-paying member of their HOA. He lived on his own land, just outside their jurisdiction. The claims were absurd, but the message was clear. They wanted to drown him in paperwork, drag him into disputes, and exhaust him until he broke. But David didn't break. Each letter was met with a reply, firm, factual, backed by county records and legal citations. Each attempt to bury him in bureaucracy only added to the growing pile of evidence against them. Still, the board wasn't finished. Their patrols returned, slower and more deliberate. SUVs once again circled near David's property at night, headlights sweeping across his barn, spotlights lingering on his home. They never dared touch the mailbox again, but their presence was heavy, suffocating, a silent reminder that the fight wasn't over. For neighbors who had been wavering, the patrols became a turning point. What once seemed like harmless security now looked like targeted harassment. Parents whispered about their children feeling watched as they biked down the street. Residents who had once defended the HOA's patrol began to ask, why are they still circling his ranch? Why are they wasting our money on intimidation? The divide deepened. At one backyard gathering, a group of homeowners openly discussed recalling the board. Another quietly reached out to a local journalist, feeding them details about fines, patrol abuse, and years of unchecked power. The HOA was trying to silence dissent, but instead, it was amplifying it. Meanwhile, David remained calm, outwardly unshaken. He kept his routine steady, mending fences, cutting hay, caring for his animals, but inside, he was watchful. He knew desperation made people reckless, and the board's pride had been deeply wounded. His caution was validated one night in late winter. The air was brittle, frost clinging to the ground. As David checked his security cameras before heading to bed, he noticed something unusual. One of the patrol SUVs had stopped near the edge of his property, engine idling, lights off. For nearly 20 minutes, it sat there in silence, watching. Then, slowly, it rolled forward, turning not onto the main road, but into the ditch just beside his fence line. It stopped again, this time closer, headlights still dark. Whoever sat behind the wheel wasn't on routine patrol. They were sending a message. David tightened his jaw as he watched the feed. This wasn't over. They couldn't destroy his mailbox, but they were still searching for cracks in his armor. Still probing for weaknesses. The next morning, he found fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the frozen soil. They hadn't breached his fence, but they were close enough to make their intentions clear. The harassment was evolving. What had once been blatant destruction was now quiet intimidation, designed to wear him down without drawing too much outside attention. But what the HOA didn't realize was that every act of retaliation only fueled the growing opposition within their own community. More neighbors spoke out, emboldened by David's resilience. Some began quietly documenting patrol behavior, snapping photos, jotting down times and dates. One resident even sent David copies of her HOA fines, along with a note that read, "You're not the only one." The board's retaliation had backfired. Their attempts to silence dissent were instead exposing their methods, dragging their tactics into the light. The patrols, once a symbol of power, now looked like vultures circling a battlefield they no longer controlled. But David knew better than to celebrate too soon. Power doesn't collapse in a single moment, it unravels slowly, violently, often with one final act of desperation. The HOA's influence was weakening, but their pride was still intact, and pride can make people dangerous. And as spring crept in, with the fields turning green and the days stretching longer, David couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. Something that would decide, once and for all, whether the HOA's reign of intimidation would end, or whether their retaliation was only just beginning. By spring, the neighborhood was no longer the quiet, compliant community the HOA had built. The crash had cracked their facade, and every act of retaliation only widened the fracture. What had once been whispers in backyards had become open conversations in driveways and across fences. The air itself seemed charged, heavy with change. It began with small acts of defiance. A family on the corner, tired of being fined for lawn decorations, installed a bright blue swing set in their yard without approval. Another homeowner left their trash bins out an extra day on purpose, daring the board to respond. When citations arrived, instead of quietly paying, they posted the letters on community forums for everyone to see. Each post spread quickly, and each fine became another example of the board's pettiness. The board's tactics, once effective, were losing their sting. The fear they had cultivated for years was giving way to frustration, then to anger, and finally to resolve. At the center of it all stood David's mailbox, still untouched, still standing tall at the edge of the ranch road. It had become more than just a piece of steel and concrete. To many, it was a monument. proof that the board's intimidation could be resisted, proof that they could be beaten. Neighbors began stopping by not just to talk, but to thank him. Some brought copies of their own HOA fines. Others shared stories of harassment, trash cans tipped, late-night patrols shining lights into their windows, vague threats whispered in letters. David listened quietly, never grandstanding, never positioning himself as a leader. But the more he listened, the more people rallied. Meetings outside of HOA control grew larger. What began as handfuls of residents in living rooms turned into dozens gathered in garages and barns. They studied bylaws, dissected budgets, and uncovered years of mismanagement buried in financial reports. The more they dug, the more corruption surfaced. Board members funneling contracts to friends, selectively enforcing rules, and spending thousands on patrols that served no real purpose. The HOA board grew defensive. At official meetings, they snapped at questions, silenced dissent, and cut microphones when residents pushed too hard. But their authority was crumbling in real time. Every outburst, every denial, only fueled the rebellion further. For David, the change was surreal. The man who had once been isolated, targeted, and harassed was now the quiet center of a movement. He hadn't sought it, but he represented it all the same. When neighbors spoke of standing up to the board, they pointed to his mailbox. When they debated how to fight back, they used his resilience as the example. But the board was not ready to concede. They pushed back harder, filing new complaints, sending more patrols, and threatening residents with lawsuits if they refused to comply. The atmosphere grew tense, almost combustible. Every confrontation at a meeting felt like a spark waiting to ignite something larger. Then came the moment no one could ignore. During a heated HOA session, one board member lost control. As residents pressed for answers about the patrol crash, about finances, about why harassment was still happening, his composure broke. He slammed his hand on the table, shouting that without the HOA, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. His words dripped with disdain, not just for David, but for anyone daring to question authority. He called them ungrateful, reckless, incapable of governing themselves. The room erupted. Residents shouted back, their frustration boiling over after years of intimidation. Some walked out, declaring they would no longer recognize the board's authority. Others stayed, demanding resignations on the spot. The meeting ended in chaos, the board's control slipping further than ever before. In the days that followed, the rebellion solidified. Petitions circulated calling for a recall vote. Residents once silent signed their names, emboldened by the growing momentum. Yard signs appeared demanding change. Cars honked in support as they passed David's ranch. What had once been an HOA board feared and obeyed was now a council under siege, desperate to cling to power it no longer truly held. But desperation is dangerous. And while the community was rallying, David knew the board would not leave quietly. Pride, ego, and years of unchecked control do not simply dissolve under pressure. They fight until the very end. And as the recall vote loomed, tension hung over the neighborhood like storm clouds. The HOA was cornered, the residents were rising, and the final clash between control and freedom was drawing near. The storm had been building for months, and now the neighborhood stood on the brink of change. The recall vote was scheduled. For the first time in years, the residents, not the board, would decide who truly held power. Tension filled every street, every driveway, every backyard conversation. Signs of division were everywhere. Handmade posters demanding accountability, patrol cars prowling slower and slower, board members retreating behind closed doors. On the day of the vote, the community center buzzed with nervous energy. Residents filed in, papers in hand, eyes sharp with purpose. Some whispered quietly to one another, while others stood boldly, ready to cast their decision. For years, fear had guided this neighborhood. But on this day, fear had given way to resolve. The boards sat at the front of the room, their faces strained, their composure brittle. They tried to maintain control, insisting that everything was under order, that the patrols were necessary, that rules must be respected. But their words fell flat. Too many had seen the crash, too many had lived under harassment, too many had grown weary of silence. When the votes were counted, the result was undeniable. The board had been recalled. The room erupted, not in chaos but in relief. Some clapped, some cried, others embraced. The grip of intimidation that had ruled the neighborhood for years was broken in a single moment of collective defiance. For David, standing quietly in the back, the moment was surreal. He had never wanted to lead a rebellion, never asked to be the center of a fight. All he had wanted was peace, a simple life on his ranch. But his resilience had sparked something larger, something powerful enough to topple the very structure that had tried to crush him. In the weeks that followed, the patrol cars vanished. The SUVs that had once circled like predators were gone, sold off or parked in storage yard. The new board, made up of neighbors who had grown tired of corruption, voted to disband the patrol entirely. Money once spent on intimidation was redirected to real improvements, repairs, community events, spaces where residents could come together rather than be torn apart. Life on the ranch grew quieter again. The nights returned to what they had once been, filled with the steady hum of crickets, the rustle of wind through tall grass, and the soft glow of moonlight over open fields. No more screeching tires, no more shattered wood. The mailbox, painted white with its bright red flag, still stood tall at the edge of the road. It was more than just a mailbox now. To the neighbors, it was a monument, a reminder of the day the HOA's intimidation collapsed under its own weight. To David, it was something deeper, a personal symbol of dignity, resilience, and the simple truth that peace, once fought for, is worth protecting. The story of the crash spread far beyond the subdivision. Articles appeared in local papers, bloggers wrote about it, and even distant communities whispered about the man who had built a mailbox that stopped harassment cold. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all, but others saw the truth beneath the humor. Sometimes the smallest stands can spark the largest changes. David never sought the spotlight, but the mailbox remained. It guarded not just letters and packages, but a hard-earned peace. And in its silent strength, it carried a lesson. Intimidation thrives in shadows, but shadows cannot withstand the light. The HOA had tried to crush him, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. And as the sun set over the ranch, casting golden light across the fields, the white mailbox gleamed quietly, an unbreakable sentinel standing firm against the storm.